The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to a little bit about the court systems in the United States. We'll talk a little bit about the state. We'll talk about state courts in general, the state of Hawaii in particular, and then the federal court system. Okay, so remember that courts are there to decide legal guilt and legal innocence, which is different from did you do it, which is factual guilt, right? Did you actually do the crime or not is factual guilt, right? That's not what courts are there. They're there to decide what's called legal guilt, which is kind of strange, but you can see that in a lecture that I've entitled Introduction to Criminal Law. So all just a little bit about the history. You can read the lecture notes for a little bit more. But in general, when the 13 colonies were formed, they each had their own sort of separate functioning court systems. It's changed over time, where basically all the states have a very similar structure. But in general, I want you to remember the difference between state and federal laws. The way the Constitution was set up, since there was already these 13 colonies and they already distrusted the power of the federal government, what they really want to do is limit the power of the federal government to overturn the states, right? And so most of the things that you think of as street crime, for example, rape, robbery, murder, assault, etc., are state crimes. And the way the Constitution was set up, that only things that the federal government had an overriding issue would they be decided in the state courts, right? So, for example, anything to do with international commerce, right? Going across, or just international borders, right? So the modern version of that would be importing drugs into the U.S., right? The other thing would be like a crime committed across state lines, right? That would go to the federal court system. Also, if there's disputes between two states, that's decided in the federal court system. Okay. This is being recorded shortly after President Biden was seated in 2021. And I don't know if you guys will remember back then, but I think it was the state of Texas sued the state of Pennsylvania, saying that basically they'd allowed people to vote illegally. It was thrown out of court because they had no evidence, but that would be the idea, is that since one state was suing in another, it was in the federal court system. Okay, so the generic setup in any of the states, and actually in the feds, if you have a trial court, that's the original court, right, where when you first go to court, you go to. You have an appeals court, which is when you go to an appeals court, you do not argue that the first court got the decision wrong. Okay, what's very important in an appeals court is you argue that my constitutional rights were violated in the first one. They somehow violated procedure, etc. But it's not they made the wrong decision. Okay, and then a Supreme Court, which is sort of the final arbiter in the state, and then also in the federal system. Okay. As you'll see, some states have an extra court, like Hawaii does. We have lower courts, so you have a lower court that can be like traffic court, stuff like that. They're sort of less major, what you might think of as minor crimes, like again traffic. Sometimes the family courts are put in here if there's a family court in the state, small claims court, etc. Okay. They're typically not decided by juries, but judges. Okay, the lower courts. The higher courts, think of those. They go by different names. I'll go over it in Hawaii, but essentially, those are the ones that are authorized to hear any criminal case in the state. Okay, so that is, in essence, is sort of the major trial court. It would be the sort of your first step if you were convicted of a serious crime like a felony. You would go to the trial court, which is usually called Superior Circuit Court, etc. Okay. Again, the thing. Remember, I said how we're not after factual guilt and factual innocence are after legal guilt, right? So there are certain rules that they all must um, adhere to in a trial court, in a higher court, which superior or circuit court. Think of it as the main trial court. So there's an adversarial process where two supposedly equal sides fight it out, and that's why the job of an attorney is to fight for their client and not really care about whether guilt or innocence, or if you were the defense attorney, right? If you were the prosecuting attorney, the same idea. You're just trying to get a conviction for the state. So there are ground rules that they have to follow, right? But again, the whole purpose is to lead to legal guilt or legal innocence. And you can read a little bit more in the lecture notes. Okay, but I just want you to know that that would be, generally speaking, the main trial court. The appellate courts are where you would, again, just as I said before, you would say, I was convicted in a trial court and they have violated my constitutional rights in some way, right? It's not like a second trial where the first court got it wrong, so I want a do-over. That's not it, right? Essentially, they're looking at constitutional rights in terms of the rules of evidence and how the sort of ground rules of a court battle are determined, okay? And you argue that was somehow violated. That'd be the most basic way to think about it. Again, it's not that the first court made the wrong decision, okay? We have a Supreme Court of some kind in every state, right? I don't know if all 50 states call it the Supreme Court. Hawaii calls it the Hawaii Supreme Court. California does. And that is the court of final jurisdiction, right? That court has jurisdiction over all the courts below it in the state, and the same on the federal level. And we'll talk about the federal level at the very end. Okay, sometimes there are alternative resolution or dispute resolution courts where they've kind of been set up to sort of take some of the burden off of the circuit courts, if you will, or the trial courts. So, for example, at one period, Hawaii had a drug diversion program where lower-level drug offenders weren't actually sent to court. They were sent to what's called a drug court, where it was a less formal situation, where they weren't trying to get them convicted. And the idea is you're not going to be convicted of a crime if you follow these steps, right? So some states have them. You can have conflict resolution systems, which are different as well. All right. They're basically an idea of having a less expensive, less burdensome way to resolve some disputes. All right. Next slide. Okay, here's a picture of Hawaii's court situation. I'm going to really quickly go to the next slide here. It does basically says the same, but again, you've got trial courts, various kinds, and then appellate courts and a Supreme Court on the top. Okay, so we have, in general, in Hawaii, we have trial courts. Okay, they're called the circuit courts in Hawaii. There's 4 geographical districts, which I'll get into next. Okay, there's a family court. Family court looks at things like child molestation, child welfare issues like that. Let's see if I can think of anything else Hawaii does. So it's generally involving children. It also deals with divorce, domestic violence, stuff like that. Okay. So that's what the family courts do. The district courts are Hawaii's lower courts, which I'll show you in a second. We'll get into a little bit more detail. Again, we have an immediate court of appeals. That's the appeals court. And then you have a Supreme Court, which is the highest court in Hawaii. Okay. Okay, we have the 4 circuits. The only reason I have this in here is this and the slide 2 before, where I had that picture of the organizational structure, is so I could give you sort of easy test questions, right? So if I asked you, if you were charged on a court, charged with a crime on Oahu, which circuit would you be in? And the answer would be the first, right? If you're on Maui, which one would you be in the second? Okay. So they just named the different ones, and you'll see there that they had a fifth, but it ended up. I'm sorry, they had a fourth, but it ended up being folded in, I guess. Okay. So I will talk a little bit more about the trial courts on the next slide. Okay. So the trial courts in Hawaii are as such. Okay. The circuit courts are where you have the jury trials. Okay. That's sort of, think about that. They have general jurisdiction in civil and criminal cases. Okay. Um, they basically, it also, the latest information I had is that they also deal with civil cases worth more than 20 grand. Not necessarily that you know all that. I just want you to know these are the trial courts in Hawaii. Okay. If you're accused of a crime, if you have a civil deal worth more than 20 grand, you're going to go to a circuit court. Think of that as the main trial court in Hawaii. Again, the family courts, right, are the ones that deal with matters of children, domestic relations, including divorce, domestic violence, stuff like that. Okay. And then you have the lower courts, which in Hawaii are called the district courts. Okay. And those are ones that, as you can see on the slide, handles the less serious ones. All right. So if I were to ask you, you had it on a test, if you were accused of child molestation or, within your family or domestic violence, which court would you go to? You'd say family court, right? If I said you were, generally had been charged with a felony, where would you go? You'd go to circuit court. And then basically the 4 geographical districts are where the circuit courts are, right? So there's a circuit court for each of the geographical districts. Okay. There are the appellate courts in Hawaii. Think of that as the appeals court. Okay. Think of it as the second highest, right? So you have the main trial courts, right? Then you have appeals court, and then you have the Supreme Court above that. Okay. Basically, the Intermediate Court of Appeals has the authority to reverse court decisions made on the level below. Okay. All the trial courts, if you will. Now, it could also be reviewed by the Supreme Court. Okay, so the Supreme Court is Hawaii's highest court. Its decisions affect all the rest of the courts in the state, right? Everything below it, right? And so the primary idea of the Supreme Court is to review decisions of the trial courts in which appeals have been allowed, right? So basically the Constitution sets it up where you get one appeal, right? So you can go to the Court of Appeals, but again, you don't say they made the wrong decision. Sorry for that pen right there. You say your rights were violated, right? So the Supreme Court doesn't necessarily need to hear your case if you don't get what you like in the appeals court. Okay. Same on the federal level, as you'll see. Okay. There are 5 members of the Hawaii Supreme Court. Currently in the United States Supreme Court, and in the federal level, there are 9. There are only 5 in Hawaii. Okay. Serves the same function as basically, let's pretend you had trial court, got convicted, you go to the appeals court, they turn you down too, and then you go to the Hawaii Supreme Court and said, hey, the appeals court really did violate my rights, and they just didn't know. And then if the Hawaii Supreme Court said, no, then you'd have to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, but then you'd have to be making some sort of wider constitutional argument. And since sometimes the Supreme Court, meaning the U.S. Supreme Court, will overturn the Supreme Court of a state. Okay? And then all of the states need to follow that. So I'm thinking there's a decision at the U.S. Supreme Court called Miranda v. Arizona, I believe. Let's just pretend it was. Okay, and that is what led to, when you're arrested, you've all seen it on the cop shows, you have the right to remain silent on anything you can and say will be against you if you cannot afford an attorney, blah, 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 right? Those are called your Miranda rights. And so essentially, I don't know if that went to the Arizona Supreme Court, but essentially it went to at least one of the appeals courts. And then basically they appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they said Arizona is not doing legal arrests. Okay. The Supreme Court agreed to hear it because they thought this was an issue that all states need to be aware of, and then we want all states in the land to deal with criminal cases like this. Okay, so that's the basic structure: trial, appeals, supreme. Okay. Okay, the federal courts are very similar. Okay, the first trial court is called the district courts. There are 94 separate districts apparently. Last I checked, I wouldn't ask you that on the test. I would ask you what is the basic trial court in a federal court. So that's called the federal district court. There are the federal appeals courts. Same idea in the state, right? You would go there and you would not say, hey, the first court, the trial court, the federal district court, made the wrong decision. You would say they violated my rights. And there are actually 12 circuits. So there are 12 geographical areas, if you will, in the states, in the United States, right? And Hawaii is in the Ninth Circuit. So if you were to be convicted in a federal district court in Hawaii and you didn't like it, you would go to the Ninth Circuit. Okay? And then there's the United States Supreme Court. Okay? It's the highest court in the whole United States, right? There are 9 members. You have 1 Supreme Court justice, right? The Chief Justice, he's called, I apologize. And then the rest of them are called Associate Justice. Very similar to Hawaii, just that you have 9 total members. Now that number 9 was not determined by the Constitution, right? It just said that they shall have a Supreme Court. And then it's over time that appeals courts came into being. Okay, and there's no number that's decided, so occasionally what you'll hear is one party might make noise about trying to what's called stack the court. So when Hawaii's native son Barack Obama was president in his last year, one of the justices died, and he wanted to nominate someone, and it was a year before, and the Senate. So Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president, and they are confirmed by the Senate. Okay. President Obama nominated him, and the Senate, which was controlled by Republicans, refused to consider his nomination of that person. And the reason they gave was that, it's in the last year of his presidency and we should let voters decide. So it had really never been done before, and then they didn't. And then President Trump was elected after Obama. And then somebody died in the last month of his term, and Republicans still held the Senate. And they basically admitted that their first excuse was not true. They just used it because they could do it, right? And so then they added a justice in 3 weeks prior to the 2021 election. Okay? So that's how you get onto the Supreme Court. Okay, so you're nominated by the president, but you are confirmed by the Senate. So some Democrats after that are saying, those Republicans were unfair. So what we should do is change the number of justices on the Supreme Court. And then if we have a Democrats control the presidency and the Senate, then we can add a bunch of Democrats. Okay, and we'll be in charge. Okay, so that's what stacking the court is known as. It's very important that the Constitution does not delineate how many members should be on the Supreme Court. That's why that sort of conversation comes up. The interesting thing about the Supreme Court, remember, is they do not have to hear your appeal. You are guaranteed 1 appeal in the Constitution, right? So you can go to the Federal Appeals Court, and they have to hear it, right? Appeals courts and Supreme Courts issue their judgments in writing so that legal scholars can use it in something called stare decisis, okay, where it's called standing by decided matters. Okay, and I talk about that in a little bit more detail in another lecture. Okay, but the whole idea is that if the court has made a decision in the past, when you have a new thing, you would say, if you go up against the court, for example, I gave an example of something called Rice v. Cayetano. Cayetano was the governor in Hawaii, and somebody sued the state of Hawaii because the Office of Hawaiian Affairs elections, you can only be Hawaiian and vote in it. Okay, and then what happened was they took it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and there was a conservative court, and they said they used civil rights law to say that race-based um, election to OHA is illegal. Okay, so then Kamehameha Schools was very concerned that if anybody ever sued them, that they're Hawaiians. It's a school for Hawaiians. I apologize for young Hawaiian kids, K through 12, set up by a princess after way back in the day. They had this school called Punahou, and Hawaiian kids weren't allowed. So she goes, "Oh, okay. Guess what? I'm going to make my own school, and it's going to be for Hawaiian kids." And she did. And then so it was for Hawaiians only. And then Kamehameha Schools was concerned because of the precedent set in Rice v. Cayetano that the Supreme Court, if it ever went that far, would outlaw their preference of Hawaiians. Right? They changed it actually to preference to Hawaiians, I believe. It used to be you need to be Hawaiian, period. So the idea would be that when you go to the Supreme Court, you argue on the basis of precedent. So if you were to go to the Supreme Court and you were on the side that was arguing that Kamehameha's preference toward Hawaiians was illegal, you would use Rice v. Cayetano as your precedent. Okay? I'm not saying whether I agree with that or disagree with that. Okay, I do have an opinion on it. My point is just that that's how one argues before the Supreme Court and why they would hear things. Okay, so they write them down, you would have a precedent, and you would use that. Generally speaking, there's a sort of basically the people who vote in the majority write an opinion, and then the dissenters, people who voted against it, will write an opinion. Sometimes there'll be multiple dissents or whatever, depending on how the particular Supreme Court justice feels about that case. All right, that's the end of the lecture.